"Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the officer said as rain hammered against my windshield, his flashlight cutting across my face like I was someone dangerous instead of a 61-year-old woman driving home from her mother's funeral. I looked at him through the cracked window and noticed the way his jaw tightened when he saw me clearly. Black, older, alone. The kind of woman people often assume doesn't belong in expensive neighborhoods after dark. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" My voice stayed calm, even though my chest still ached from the funeral service earlier that evening. I had spent the last 6 hours listening to relatives talk about my mother in hushed voices while cold rain soaked the cemetery outside Baltimore. I was exhausted. My black dress still smelled faintly like church candles and wet wool. But the officer ignored my question completely. "License and registration." His tone was clipped, impatient. I handed them over slowly. He glanced at my address, then at the silver Lexus I'd been driving for nearly 10 years. It wasn't flashy, but it was clean and well-maintained. My late husband used to say the car fit me perfectly. Quiet elegance. The officer looked back at me again, and something in his expression shifted. Suspicion. Maybe disappointment that I didn't fit whatever story he had already invented in his head. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked. "My mother's funeral." For half a second, he almost looked embarrassed. Almost. Then his eyes drifted toward the leather briefcase sitting on the passenger seat. "What's in the bag?" I followed his stare calmly. "Work documents." "Open it." The rain intensified, drumming against the hood of my car while traffic hissed by on the highway behind us. A few drivers slowed down to look. I could already feel their curiosity pressing through the darkness. Another black woman stopped by police. Another scene people would forget by morning. "Officer," I said carefully, "is there a reason you're asking to search my belongings?" His hand rested near his belt as he leaned slightly closer to my window. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." There it was. The power shift he thought he controlled. I stepped out slowly, my heels sinking slightly into the wet pavement. The cold wind cut through my coat immediately. He positioned me near the back of the car while another patrol vehicle pulled in behind us, lights flashing blue and red across the rain-covered road. One officer glanced at me briefly, then looked away. The younger one stayed silent. But Officer Mercer kept staring at that briefcase like he'd already convinced himself it contained something illegal. "You nervous?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I answered softly. "Are you?" He frowned, clearly irritated that I wasn't shaking or pleading or raising my voice. Calm, unsettled men like him, especially when it came from someone they had already decided was beneath them. Without another word, he reached into my car, grabbed the briefcase, and snapped open the locks. The moment his eyes landed on the contents inside, all the color drained from his face. Inside the briefcase were not stacks of cash or anything dramatic like Officer Mercer had probably imagined. There was a dark blue folder stamped with the seal of the state of Maryland, a leather credential wallet, several case files secured with red tabs, and a silver nameplate that read Vanessa Brooks, State Attorney. For a moment, the only sound between us was the rain striking the pavement. Mercer stared down at the open briefcase as if his brain could not fully process what he was seeing. His shoulders stiffened. His mouth parted slightly. I watched the confidence drain from his face inch by inch. It was almost fascinating how quickly authority changed shape when it realized it had made a mistake. He picked up the credential wallet with slow fingers and opened it carefully. His flashlight reflected off the gold badge inside. I could see his throat move as he swallowed hard. Behind us, the younger officer shifted uncomfortably near the second patrol car. Even from several feet away, he had clearly seen enough to understand the situation had changed. Completely. Mercer looked back at me, but this time there was no arrogance in his expression, only calculation, fear beginning to settle beneath it. "You are a state attorney?" he asked quietly. I folded my hands in front of me to keep them warm against the cold wind. "That is what the credential says." His eyes dropped again to the files in the briefcase. One of the folders had partially opened when he searched through it. Across the top page, in large black letters, were the words "Internal Corruption Investigation." I noticed exactly when he read it because his breathing changed immediately afterward. Shorter, tighter. The rainwater dripping from the edge of his hat slid down the side of his face, but he did not even seem to notice anymore. "You could have told me," he muttered. I almost smiled at that. Almost. "You never asked who I was," I said calmly. You only decided what I was. The younger officer looked away the second I said it. Somewhere across the highway, thunder rolled low through the night sky. Cars continued passing us, headlights stretching across the wet road in long silver streaks. But the energy around us had shifted completely now. Officer Mercer stepped back from the car and quickly closed the briefcase, suddenly treating it with more care than he had shown me during the last 15 minutes. "Ma'am, I think there has been some misunderstanding here," he said. There it was, the beginning of the retreat. I had heard that tone before in courtrooms. Men growing careful when consequences finally became real. "A misunderstanding," I repeated softly. "Is that what you call searching a grieving woman on the side of Interstate 95 without probable cause?" His jaw tightened again, but differently this time. Not anger. Panic. He glanced toward the dashboard camera in his patrol car, then toward the small body camera attached to his uniform. The realization was settling in fully now. Everything had been recorded. Every order. Every assumption. Every unnecessary escalation. The younger officer finally approached us slowly. "Sir," he said quietly to Mercer, "Sergeant Cruz is on her way." Mercer did not answer immediately. He just kept staring at the closed briefcase in his hands like it might explode if he opened it again. Then, for the first time since the traffic stop began, he avoided looking directly at me. The rain had started to slow by the time Sergeant Helen Cruz arrived, but the cold air still carried that heavy dampness that settles deep into your bones after midnight. Her SUV pulled onto the shoulder with controlled precision, headlights washing over the scene in pale white light. The moment she stepped out, I saw the exact second she recognized me. Her expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. Respect replacing confusion. "Ma'am," she said carefully as she approached, her voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "I am Sergeant Cruz." Officer Mercer straightened beside her, trying to recover some version of authority, but it was already slipping through his fingers. "Sergeant, I can explain," he began quickly. She held up one hand without even looking at him. "I would prefer to hear from Ms. Brooks first." That silence afterward felt heavier than the storm clouds above us. Mercer lowered his eyes for half a second. Tiny moment, but revealing. Men like him were used to controlling conversations, used to deciding who deserved patience and who deserved suspicion. I stood near the back of my car, my coat pulled tightly against the wind. "I was driving home from Baltimore," I explained calmly. Officer Mercer stopped me for what he described as suspicious driving behavior. He then searched my vehicle and my belongings. Sergeant Cruz glanced toward Mercer. "Did you establish probable cause for the search?" Mercer shifted his weight uncomfortably. She was acting nervous. Even he sounded unconvinced saying it now. Cruz looked back at me briefly, then at the briefcase sitting closed on the hood of the patrol car. "And the briefcase?" she asked quietly. "He opened it without my consent," I answered. Mercer spoke again, faster this time. "Sergeant, I did not know who she was." I watched Sergeant Cruz very carefully then because experienced people often reveal more through restraint than reaction. She inhaled slowly before responding. "That is exactly the problem, officer." The younger officer near the second patrol car suddenly became very interested in staring at the pavement. Mercer's face tightened. "I was following procedure." "No," Cruz said evenly. "Procedure requires articulable suspicion. What you had was assumption." The words landed hard because everyone standing there knew she was right. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Highway traffic continued rushing past us, while water dripped steadily from the tree line nearby. Somewhere in the distance, another siren echoed faintly through the night. Mercer finally cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you felt disrespected in any way, that was not my intention." I almost laughed at that, but exhaustion held the sound inside me. My mother used to say people reveal their character most clearly when they realize there might be consequences. Until that moment, Officer Mercer had spoken to me like I was a problem. Now he sounded like a man rehearsing sentences he hoped would save his career. Sergeant Cruz folded her arms. "Officer Mercer," she said quietly, "did you review her registration before removing her from the vehicle?" "Yes." "Then you saw her full name." He hesitated. "Too long." Cruz nodded slightly, almost to herself. "I thought so." The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable now. He shifted again beside the patrol vehicle, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Mercer rubbed rainwater from the side of his face. "It was dark," he muttered weakly. "And you assumed," Cruz replied. The air went silent again after that. Cold, sharp, final. Then Sergeant Cruz turned toward me with a professionalism that should have existed from the beginning. Ms. Brooks, she said carefully, Internal Affairs will need a full report from everyone involved tonight. I looked once at Officer Mercer. He still could not meet my eyes. By the time the officers finally allowed me to leave, it was nearly 1:30 in the morning. The rain had stopped completely, but the road still glistened beneath the highway lights as I drove south toward Annapolis. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady despite the exhaustion pressing behind my eyes. Most people assume moments like that fill you with anger. But anger is loud. What I felt was quieter than that, older than that. A kind of tired understanding that settles into your bones after decades of watching people decide who you are before you even speak. The windshield wipers moved slowly across the glass while my mother's funeral program sat folded beside me on the passenger seat. Her smiling photograph stared upward beneath the soft glow of the dashboard lights. Earlier that afternoon, dozens of people had filled the church to talk about her grace, her strength, the way she carried herself with dignity even when life gave her every reason not to. My mother grew up in South Carolina in the 1950s. She used to tell me stories about department stores where black women could spend money but could not try on clothes. Restaurants where people smiled politely while refusing service. She taught me very early that humiliation often arrives wearing professionalism. Calm voices, clean uniforms, friendly smiles hiding ugly assumptions underneath. Never beg people to see your humanity, she would tell me while brushing my hair before school. Just stand still long enough for them to reveal theirs. I thought about those words the entire drive home. Officer Mercer was not unique. That was the uncomfortable truth underneath everything that happened that night. He simply felt safe enough to act on assumptions many people carry quietly every day. I exited the highway near the waterfront district and passed rows of dark townhouses glowing softly beneath porch lights. Annapolis always looked peaceful after midnight. Wealthy, polished. The kind of place where people notice immediately when someone looks out of place. Earlier that evening, before the traffic stop, I had stopped briefly at a gas station just outside Baltimore County. I remembered seeing Officer Mercer there now. He had been parked near the convenience store entrance drinking coffee while watching customers come and go through the ring. At the time, I barely noticed him. But looking back, I remembered the way his eyes lingered on me when I stepped out of my car. Not curiosity, evaluation. As though he was trying to solve a puzzle that bothered him. An older black woman alone in an expensive vehicle after dark. He had already written the story in his head before his patrol. Lights ever flashed behind me. The realization did not hurt nearly as much as it once would have. Age changes certain things. At 61, you stop expecting fairness to arrive naturally. You simply learn to recognize power when it reveals itself carelessly. My phone vibrated suddenly through the silence of the car. Sergeant Cruz. I let it ring twice before answering through the speaker system. Ms. Brooks, she said carefully. I wanted to inform you that Internal Affairs has already requested all body camera footage from tonight. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. That was fast. There was a short pause before she responded. Officer Mercer has prior complaints. I said nothing for several seconds. Outside, the dark water near the harbor reflected silver beneath the moonlight finally breaking through the clouds. I see, I answered quietly. Sergeant Cruz exhaled softly on the other end of the line. For what it is worth, ma'am, I am sorry for how you were treated tonight. I tightened my grip slightly on the wheel. So was my mother, I said. I barely slept after I got home that night. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying and walked downstairs to the kitchen instead. The house felt painfully quiet without my mother's voice somewhere in the background. For the last 3 years, after her health began declining, she had lived with me in the waterfront townhouse my husband and I bought decades earlier. Every morning she used to sit near the window with her tea and comment on the boats moving across the harbor. Even when arthritis twisted her fingers and slowed her steps, she carried herself with a softness that made people lower their voices around her. I stood at the kitchen counter staring at the untouched casserole dishes relatives had brought after the funeral. Aluminum trays wrapped in foil. Condolence food. The kind people bring when they do not know what else to offer grief. My phone buzzed again against the marble countertop. This time it was not Sergeant Cruz. It was Jamal. My nephew's voice sounded tense the moment I answered. Aunt Vanessa, are you okay? I frowned slightly. Why would you ask that? There was a pause on the line. Then I heard him exhale heavily. You are online. I closed my eyes for a brief second. Of course I was. What exactly is online? Somebody posted traffic stop footage about an hour ago. It is everywhere now. I leaned one hand against the counter while fatigue settled deeper into my chest. Body camera footage? No. A civilian recording. Somebody driving past filmed part of it. I walked slowly toward the living room and picked up the television remote. The moment the screen lit up, I understood immediately. My image stood frozen across multiple news channels. Black funeral coat. Rain falling around flashing police lights. Officer Mercer standing beside my car with my briefcase open in his hands. The headline beneath the footage read local state attorney detained during highway stop. Another channel used different wording. Questions raised after late-night traffic stop involving senior prosecutor. Jamal stayed quiet while I watched. Finally, he spoke again. People are angry. I lowered the volume slightly. People are tired, I corrected softly. On the television, a legal analyst discussed racial profiling while replaying the same 20 seconds of footage again and again. Even without audio, the imbalance was obvious. The posture, the distance, the way Mercer had positioned himself beside me while I stood alone near the highway barrier in the rain. There are moments when humiliation becomes visible enough that people can no longer pretend not to recognize it. This was one of them. My phone started vibrating repeatedly across the coffee table. Messages, emails, missed calls, colleagues from the Attorney General's office, civil rights organizations, local reporters. One message came from Judge Eleanor Whitmore, who had known me for nearly 20 years. Proud of your restraint. Another came from an old law school friend in Chicago. They picked the wrong woman tonight. I sat slowly on the edge of the couch while the television continued flashing images of the traffic stop across the room. Outside, dawn was beginning to lighten the harbor water beyond the windows. Gray sky, quiet waves, the world continuing forward as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Not because people suddenly discovered injustice existed. They already knew that. What unsettled them was seeing composure where they expected chaos, dignity where they expected fear. Jamal's voice softened through the phone. Aunt Vanessa, what are you going to do? I looked once more at the frozen image of Officer Mercer staring into my open briefcase. Then I reached for the remote and turned the television off completely. The silence afterward felt almost peaceful. The same thing I have always done, I answered quietly. My job. By 9 o'clock that morning, every major station in Maryland had picked up the story. I knew because the television screens inside the state attorney's office were all tuned to different channels when I walked through the lobby. Conversations stopped almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for silence to ripple through the room before people quickly pretended to return to work. I had spent 27 years inside courtrooms. I understood public attention better than most people. The younger attorneys looked nervous for me. The older ones looked angry. One legal assistant near the elevators quietly touched my arm as I passed. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. Her voice carried a softness that told me she had seen the footage more than once already. I gave her a small nod and continued toward my office. The hallway smelled faintly like coffee and printer toner, familiar enough to calm the noise still lingering in my mind from the night before. My heels echoed steadily against the marble floor while staff members glanced toward me through partially open office doors. Some people offered sympathetic smiles. Others avoided eye contact completely. Discomfort makes many people suddenly fascinated by paperwork. When I reached my office, my assistant Carla was already waiting beside my desk, holding a tablet in one hand and a stack of printed emails in the other. Carla had worked with me for 11 years. Former military. Extremely organized. Impossible to rattle. But even she looked unsettled. You have received 32 media requests since 6 this morning, she said carefully. And Internal Affairs contacted us directly. I removed my coat slowly and hung it near the window. Did they send formal notice? Not yet, but they requested a meeting this afternoon. I nodded once. Across the room, the harbor stretched beyond the tall office windows in pale, silver waves beneath the cloudy sky. Everything looked calm outside. Controlled. That contrast almost made me smile. Carla hesitated briefly before speaking again. There is something else. She handed me the tablet. On the screen was a photograph of Officer Mercer entering police headquarters earlier that morning. Cameras surrounded him from every direction. Reporters shouting questions. Flashing lights. His expression looked strained in a way I recognized immediately. Not guilt. Fear of losing status. Fear of becoming publicly associated with the very behavior he probably dismissed privately for years. Beneath the photo, comments flooded social media faster than moderators could manage them. Some defended him automatically. Others demanded termination. But one phrase appeared repeatedly across hundreds of posts. He thought she was powerless. I handed the tablet back quietly. People always believe power announces itself loudly, I said. Carla studied me for a moment. Are you angry? The question lingered in the room longer than I expected. I walked toward the window before answering. Down below, pedestrians moved along the waterfront carrying umbrellas against the mist drifting in from the bay. Ordinary people heading to work, buying coffee, living ordinary lives while arguing online about justice between meetings and lunch breaks. No, I answered finally. I am disappointed. Carla folded her arms lightly. That sounds worse. Before I could respond, someone knocked sharply on the office door. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered without waiting for permission. Tall, silver-haired, immaculate navy suit. She had served on the federal bench for nearly 15 years and still carried herself with the calm authority of someone used to making final decisions. The moment the door closed behind her, she looked directly at me. Vanessa, she said evenly. Do you know who Officer Mercer pulled over 2 months ago? I turned slowly from the window. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. A black pediatric surgeon driving home from Johns Hopkins. No citation issued. No report filed. But there was a complaint. The room went quiet. Carla stopped moving entirely beside my desk. Judge Whitmore stepped closer before continuing in the same controlled tone. And according to Internal Affairs, yours was not the first. The Internal Affairs meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon inside a conference room on the 4th floor of police headquarters. By the time I arrived, reporters had already gathered outside the building behind metal barricades while camera crews stood in clusters beneath the cloudy Baltimore sky. Carla walked beside me carrying a leather portfolio against her chest. Neither of us spoke much on the ride over. There was nothing left to speculate about now. The footage had spread too far. The story had grown beyond one traffic stop. Inside the lobby, officers moved carefully around us with the stiff politeness people use when they know everyone is watching. I noticed several younger black officers glance toward me briefly before looking away again. Some with sympathy, some with exhaustion. They understood the larger conversation unfolding beneath the headlines better than anyone. Sergeant Cruz met us near the elevators. She looked more tired than she had the night before. Ms. Brooks, she said quietly, they are ready for you upstairs. I nodded once. As the elevator doors closed, Cruz hesitated before speaking again. 3 additional complaints were formally reopened this morning. Carla looked toward her immediately. Against Mercer? Cruz gave a small nod. 1 nurse practitioner. 1 real estate broker. 1 pediatric surgeon. She paused briefly. All black women over 50. The elevator continued rising in silence after that. Slow numbers glowing above the doors. 2nd floor. 3rd floor. 4th. By the time we entered the conference room, the atmosphere inside already felt tense enough to crack. Internal Affairs investigators sat along one side of the table with laptops open and printed documents spread before them. Near the far wall, Officer Mercer sat alone, beside a union representative. He looked different than he had on the highway. Smaller somehow. The sharp confidence from the night before had disappeared completely beneath dark circles and a tightly clenched jaw. But what struck me most was not guilt. It was disbelief. Men like him often assume systems will protect them forever until the exact moment they realize those systems value public image more than loyalty. One investigator introduced himself before activating a recording device at the center of the table. For the record, he began evenly. This meeting concerns the traffic stop conducted on Interstate 95 involving Ms. Vanessa Brooks on October 14th at approximately 11:42 p.m. Mercer kept his eyes lowered. The investigator turned toward him first. Officer Mercer, explain why you initiated the stop. Mercer cleared his throat. The vehicle appeared suspicious. Define suspicious. Another pause. Longer this time. It was moving below the speed limit. One investigator typed something immediately, while another exchanged a quick glance with Sergeant Cruz near the wall. 5 miles below the speed limit during heavy rain. The investigator replied calmly. Correct. Mercer shifted in his chair. Yes. The room fell silent for several seconds, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lighting overhead. Then the investigator asked the question everyone already knew mattered most. At what point did you decide Ms. Brooks represented a threat? Mercer finally looked up then. His eyes moved briefly toward me before sliding away again. I did not think she was a threat. Then why remove her from the vehicle? Mercer opened his mouth once before closing it again. The union representative leaned forward slightly, as if considering whether to interrupt. But nobody spoke. Nobody rescued him. Finally, Mercer answered quietly. I thought she was hiding something. I folded my hands calmly on the table. No, I said softly. Every head in the room turned toward me. Mercer stared directly at the table again. You thought I was powerless. The silence afterward felt absolute. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. By the end of it, the polished confidence officer Mercer once carried had completely disappeared beneath layers of nervous exhaustion. Internal affairs investigators moved carefully through every detail from the traffic stop, while body camera footage played repeatedly across the monitor mounted on the conference room wall. Watching yourself on video is always unsettling. Watching yourself remain calm while someone quietly strips away your dignity is something else entirely. The footage showed rain streaking across the patrol lights while Mercer questioned me beside the highway. Every unnecessary command sounded sharper now inside the silent conference room. Every interruption, every assumption. At one point, the investigator paused the video just as Mercer reached for my briefcase. Officer, he asked evenly, what specific evidence led you to believe the contents of this briefcase represented criminal activity? Mercer rubbed both hands together slowly before answering. Her behavior seemed evasive. The investigator tilted his head slightly. How? Another long pause. She avoided direct answers. I finally spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. I answered every question asked of me. Nobody disputed it because the recording made denial impossible. The investigator resumed the footage. On screen, my voice remained calm, while Mercer's grew steadily more aggressive. It was subtle enough that many people probably would not have noticed at first. But subtlety is often where prejudice lives safest. In tone, in posture, in suspicion that arrives before evidence does. Judge Whitmore sat quietly near the far end of the table observing everything with folded hands and unreadable eyes. Carla remained beside me taking occasional notes without speaking. Meanwhile, Mercer looked smaller with every passing minute. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone slowly realizing the version of himself he depended on no longer existed once exposed to daylight. Then the investigator switched to footage from Mercer's earlier traffic stops over the previous 6 months. Different highways, different nights, different women. Yet the pattern repeated almost perfectly every time. Black drivers over 40. Questions escalating quickly. Vehicle searches without clear justification. No citations issued afterward. Just prolonged stops, ending in vague warnings once nothing illegal was found. The room grew noticeably colder as clip after clip played across the screen. Even the union representative stopped interrupting by then. Finally, one investigator closed his folder carefully and looked directly at Mercer. Do you understand why this pattern concerns the department? Mercer swallowed hard before answering. Yes. Do you believe race influenced your decisions during these stops? Mercer hesitated again. Outside the conference room windows, evening sunlight had begun fading over downtown Baltimore, casting long shadows across the glass table. Nobody moved. Nobody rescued him from the silence gathering around his answer. No, he said quietly at last. The investigator nodded once, almost sadly. Then he turned toward me. Ms. Brooks, is there anything you would like added to the record before we conclude today? I looked briefly toward the dark monitor screen where the final image from the body camera still remained frozen. Rain. Highway lights. A tired black woman standing silently beside her car while an officer searched through her belongings because he believed he could. My mother would have recognized that image instantly. Different decade. Different uniform. Same assumption underneath it all. I folded my hands slowly in front of me. Yes, I answered softly. Every eye in the room settled on me again. People often speak about prejudice as if it always arrives loudly. But most of the time it sounds professional, controlled, reasonable. The room stayed completely silent. Mercer stared downward at the table. That is what makes it dangerous, I continued quietly. And that is why so many people pretend not to see it until it happens to someone they respect. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. 3 weeks later, the city had mostly moved on to newer headlines. Another political scandal. Another viral video. Another public outrage competing for attention. That is how modern news works. Loud for a moment, then gone. But inside police headquarters, the consequences of that rainy night had not disappeared nearly as quickly. Officer Daniel Mercer was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending final review from Internal Affairs. 2 supervisors faced disciplinary investigations for ignoring earlier complaints. Several unresolved traffic stop cases were quietly reopened. Nobody announced those details dramatically on television. Systems rarely expose themselves louder than necessary. They prefer corrections hidden inside paperwork and procedural language. But change had started moving beneath the surface anyway. One Friday morning, nearly a month after the stop, I returned to court for the first time since my mother's funeral. The courthouse in downtown Baltimore looked exactly as it always had. Tall stone columns, metal detectors humming near the entrance, lawyers balancing coffee cups and legal folders while rushing through crowded hallways. Ordinary movement, ordinary noise. Yet people watched me differently now as I crossed the lobby. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact entirely. Public attention changes the atmosphere around a person even after the cameras disappear. Carla walked beside me carrying case files while discussing the morning schedule. The hearing was moved to courtroom 4, she said. And Channel 7 requested another interview. No interviews, I answered calmly. She smiled faintly. I assumed. As we approached the courtroom entrance, I noticed a young black woman sitting alone on one of the wooden benches outside the hall. Maybe late 20s. Business suit slightly wrinkled. Nervous hands twisting together in her lap. The moment our eyes met, she stood quickly. Ms. Brooks. Her voice trembled slightly. Yes. She hesitated before speaking again. I just wanted to thank you. I studied her quietly while courthouse noise echoed around us. For what? She swallowed hard. Because I saw the footage. Her eyes lowered briefly. Something similar happened to me last year. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Like maybe I was overreacting. My chest tightened unexpectedly at the sadness buried beneath those words. Overreacting. The sentence so many people learn to say after surviving quiet humiliation. I stepped closer to her carefully. You were not imagining it, I said softly. Tears gathered in her eyes almost instantly, though she smiled at the same time. Strange how validation can undo pain people have carried silently for years. Carla touched my arm gently to remind me the hearing was about to begin. I gave the young woman one last nod before turning toward the courtroom doors. Inside, sunlight streamed across polished wooden benches while attorneys organized paperwork beneath the low murmur of conversation. Ordinary morning. Ordinary cases. The world continuing forward exactly as it always does. Yet as I walked toward the prosecution table, I noticed several younger lawyers watching me quietly from across the room. Not because I had become famous. Not because of television interviews or headlines. But because composure unsettles people more deeply than outrage ever will. Especially when they expected fear instead. I placed my briefcase carefully beside my chair before taking my seat. The same briefcase Officer Mercer had opened that night on the highway believing he would find weakness inside it. Instead, he found credentials. Authority. A woman he never imagined he would have to answer to. But that was never the real lesson. The real lesson was much simpler than that. Dignity does not become valuable only after power recognizes it. It was always valuable. Some people are simply too blind to see it until losing everything forces them to look again.